Foucault still wants to treat us to a few surprises, if you wish. And if we try to, in a way, not to put too fine a point on it, but if we try to bring together what he has explained to us so far, most of it is about the individual. Yeah, so about the genesis of the individual. So at the end of chapter 8, 9, we begin to have a more or less complete idea of the modern individual as identified, as deconstructed, if you wish, analyzed by Foucault. Okay? And he shows very clearly that the modern individual is a product of power. So we, the free, autonomous individuals that all of us believe we are, and we are, of course, are all results of control and of restrictions and of measurement and of knowledge. And it is the combination of all these different factors that actually makes us into who we are. So if we have an idea about ourselves now, all right, that idea itself, according to Foucault, is the outcome of 1.5 centuries, 2 centuries of development of a new power regime that revolves around knowledge. Okay, knowledge that is a knowledge that produces us. It creates us. Okay? And here's the bad news, of course, for those of you who have been thinking about it. His view of the individual, notably of individual freedom, is not, how should I say, not very optimistic, right? He's not somebody who believes in the Enlightenment idea of all of us born with incredible faculties, and with massive opportunities for employment. No, he sees individual freedom, all right, as the little area we have in which we maneuver the rules of control. And so the accent that I referred to earlier. So individual freedom is actually a very, very small part of who we are. Most of who we are is an effect of control, of what we might also call regimentation. So we are brought in order, an order is constructed around us. We live in that order, we get born into that order, and we are shaped by that order. So if you want to remember anything about Foucault, this is it, right? The individual is the outcome, the result and effect of power. Okay? So the individual is not the result of one's individual self-deployment. No. It is the effect of others. Of a system of power control that created individuals. Okay? But as I said now, it's going to take us a step further. In the next 2 sessions, or in the next 2 lectures that he gives, he will move basically from the development of this individual, the normal individual, he will now move basically to society, right? So he will now basically expand this idea of the individual and address the question, but why did we need individuals like that? So in other words, why did all these new systems emerge, and what is the bigger plan behind it? Or if it wasn't a plan, what are the bigger drivers, motivations, and certainly effects of it? All right? So this is the question that he will now develop, and he will also develop it next year, or at least in 1976, in the next range of lectures, so next series of lectures that he will give, will have the label society must be protected. And so you see, we move from abnormal, which is about an individual, to society. And it is, of course, the final, let's say, the concluding lectures that he gives about abnormal, that he begins to introduce the broader problematic of next year. Society needs to be protected. And society has to be protected. He basically takes this idea, how things like the modern police emerge, right? as a sort of, he calls it raison d'etat, the reason of the state. And so the state needs instruments that make all of these new elements about knowledge control, etc., that make them practical. And he also emphasizes very, very strongly that the way in which the state organizes control is moral. And so we very often think about the legal as the main dimension of state power. So a state, of course, is organized legally. But he emphasizes, that behind or above the law, there is a moral universe that is even more powerful. And it is the moral universe that basically dominates the entire new system of control, power, and the way knowledge, circulates in that. Morality and knowledge. Morality, knowledge, power. So if we take that little triangle, so to speak, then we have a very, very important and absolutely central notion in Foucault's work. Morality, knowledge, and power. Usually, most people focus only on the latter two, knowledge, power. However, he very strongly emphasizes a third element, which is morality. So the way in which we produce moral rules that are vastly stronger, vastly more compelling than the legal ones, okay? Reason being, morality is a thing that is brought down to the absolute level of the individual, to the smallest element of individual behavior. I've already given examples of that. This is the point he develops here in abnormal. Being abnormal, and I underscore it, is not a legal category. So if you're abnormal, you have not violated a law. You're just abnormal. Abnormal, so norm is there. Normality, abnormality is about norms, not about laws. And so this is a vital element in understanding almost everything that Foucault has done. So if I would ask you, hey guys, Foucault, what is it about? You would be able to smash me off my feet by saying, well, it's actually very simple, morality, knowledge, power. But what I would like to do now in what follows is I'm going to take you to, I think, page 268, 269. And it looks like an anecdote. Because in that chapter, or at least until now, again, he's been going on about his campaigns against masturbation and so on. In light of what we've seen before, all of this is clear. And now he mentions another thing. He says, there was another campaign, rarely mentioned. And that campaign was about the working class family. So here was another state campaign in France, early 19th century, first half of the 19th century, in which the working class had to be organized, if you wish. And so something had to be done about the working class. And what I would like to do, and I think it's very, very important, because now we begin to see the rationale behind this new system of power and control. Why do we need it? The reason for that is economic, or at least has to do with the emerging of a new economic system, which we now know as modern capitalism. And it has to do with the regulation of the workforce. So if the question is why did we need all of these new forms of knowledge about people, new forms of control, and so on and so on, there is a political answer to it. A very, very big picture. And a very big picture is the control of the working class. The control of the working class. I've already mentioned a number of elements earlier. So this idea, of course, that the period in which Foucault, the period that he describes is the period, of course, of the genesis of the modern working class. And it is, of course, an effect, or it is an element of the genesis of the industrial system. In the second half of the 19th century, you have mass urbanization, so all cities grow enormously, all right, and it's a very, very massive shift of the rural population to the urban working class population. So you see millions of people all over Europe leave the rural areas, okay, and move to the cities in order to work in these new factories, in the new industrial environments that emerge exactly at that moment. And that creates problems. And so what I would like to do today is to illustrate that political thing, that political dimension. And the label I use for it is this one, making the working class behave, because it is about behavior. All right, we've already seen that. Being normal, and again, has nothing to do with the law, it has nothing to do with big things, it has to do with small things, it has to do with behavior. All right? And so here is one of the important dimensions that he doesn't really develop here. He actually doesn't really develop it in any of his lectures, a little bit later when he talks about neoliberalism, but even then. But it is historically a very important dimension to what he describes here. It's a transformation of society from a, let's say, a traditional society in which the cities were relatively small, basically trading cities, okay? And most of the population was rural and involved in, say, self-reliant agriculture, all the way to a completely new society in which enormous numbers of the population have become industrial workers in a new system of economic relationships. Okay, so they don't work for, let's say, potatoes anymore or milk, they work for money, right? And they have no means of production, so they don't have milk or eggs to sell, they only have their labor to sell. Okay, so this is a new situation, this is a new society, and in many ways it is a society that we're now abandoning. And so it was a society that was ours almost all over the world until, let's say, the 1980s. Certainly in Western Europe, it ended in the 1980s. But of course, you know, the structures of those particular societies are still with us. Let's have a look at how a very important aspect of that structure emerged. And again, so it is about behavior. It is about behavior. I've already mentioned the large political issues. This urbanization, of course, created the fear of revolution, and for very good reasons, because in the 19th century there were plenty of revolutions and rebellions. So these new enormous numbers of working class people, very often living in abject poverty, they rebelled. They were not very happy, right? So there was violence, there were revolutions. 1948 was a revolutionary year, and 1917, 1978 was another one. So there was a never-ending cycle of revolutionary danger that was the effect of this big transformation in societies here in Western Europe. And so the industrialization, with urbanization, with the growth of an enormous proletariat, created political instability. Okay. So this is the point of departure. There is a widespread fear of revolution, and that fear, of course, is justified. And so, I mean, if governments indeed might fall, and if the wealthy might be, how should I say, assailed and even, you know, destroyed, like in the Soviet Revolution, 1917, by the working class, it's a realistic fear. But the fear was widespread, and there's huge literature about it. And it starts actually around the period of the French Revolution already, because there also you could see the so-called rabble, ordinary people, all right, ordinary working people, marching through the streets and doing things that they had never done before, like insulting the aristocracy, deposing the government, and beheading the king. Imagine. There was a shock, an absolute shock through the system. So the 19th century is largely dominated by a fear for revolution, and it actually goes on in the 20th century, of course, after the Soviet Revolution, and then later in China. The fear of revolution, as I said, was well grounded, okay? And one of the things you have in the 19th century is the beginning of the creation of an image of the proletariat. So the working class becomes, how should I say, recognizable. So we know how to recognize the working class. When we see them, we know that they are working class. Now remember, it was a class that did not exist before. All right, this was an entirely new phenomenon. Punk, does that ring a bell to you guys? The late 70s, punk period. People my age, in fact, at least, you know, we were in that generation who would start dressing in a weird way. We would want to be deliberately ugly. Right? We would want to look very shabby. We would do very weird things like, you know, having green hair. But there was also self-mutilation, like, so you would start piercing yourself, which was undone. And of course, these bodies were instantly recognizable, readable, we would now say. And it was exactly the same thing in the 19th century. The readability of the working class. They became identifiable on the basis of behavioral features. Right? Behavioral features. Nobody can see the amount of money you have in the bank. But everyone was able to see whether you were a member of the working class or of the middle class or of the bourgeoisie, the aristocracy, and so on. And so here are a number of elements. Was food, specific food that they consumed, of course the way they looked, the dresses they wore, housing, and then of course the structure of the families. And you begin to get a literature all through the 19th century, and of course Foucault also draws on it here and there, in a number of places, but the literature that begins to describe the working class as a working class, right, as an identifiable working class. For instance, in the work of Charles Dickens, that's where you see it. So that's where you begin to see this graphic imagination of the working class. And I'm going to show you a number of these features. And so the working class becomes identifiable, it becomes readable as a social group or formation. The food, so these people eat plain food, low quality food, cheap food, not much meat, but mostly bread, all right? And more industrialized food. So one of the things that emerges, of course, in the context of the growth of an urban proletariat, hundreds of thousands of people congregating in places like London, Paris, and others, okay, is we need bread for 100,000 people every day. Lots of bread and cheap, right? So you begin to get industrialized food. Food that is no longer made locally, all right? That is made in factories itself. So the food industry, again, emerges. And the most important consumers of industrial food are the working class. Okay? Even now. All the way through now. Cheap food, you know, hamburgers and what have you, fast food, is of course not Michelin star fine dining. It's also very, very cheap. And if you only have money, if you only have a little bit of money, the only food you can actually afford is manufactured food, mass manufactured food. We've done research over the past number of years in which we follow women, mostly with an immigrant background. And these women are moms, usually single moms, right? And they live on very, very small budgets, 400 euros a month, okay? And they have to feed their children. So what do they buy? They buy processed food. For instance, they buy potato chips, right? Very big bags, and it gives protein, but it doesn't give protein, it gives fat and salt and some minerals, etc., and fills them, right? Very, very cheap food. Okay? So food became an index, an element that very, very quickly identified the different social classes. Very, very quickly. Okay? And it is interesting to see that a lot of the food we now call traditional, right, like, you know, traditional Belgian food would be beer stew with French fries. Truly delicious. Beer stew ladies and gentlemen, is not beef stew. It's made with horse meat. Horse meat. Who finds that unbelievable? Horses were never bred for meat. Horses were industrial material. Okay? They were the tractors of the day. And in these very big industrial environments, there were plenty of horses, like in the coal mines, right? Or in the harbors. Thousands and thousands of horses, and when they were old or injured, they were slaughtered. That was very, very cheap meat. And usually, when you were poor, you did not have money, basically, to give every member of your family a beautiful steak, all right? So you had to buy leftovers, usually small quantities of very greasy meat, okay? And that's the origin of mince meat. And that's how it started. That's how the hamburger started. Very little low-quality meat that has to be distributed over a large community. But what happened in the second half of the 19th century was the development of a new cuisine, a working-class cuisine. For instance, so let me revert to beef stew, beer stew again. This low-quality meat is usually quite hard to eat. So if you boil it, it becomes quite hard. Unless you use alcohol to soften it, alcohol or milk. But milk was expensive, so they used alcohol. Beer was a very cheap thing, also very working class. So you put low-quality meat in a stewing pot, not too much because you don't have a lot of money, but you need to feed like 6 or 7 members of the family. A lot of beer on top of it, and then you leave it on the stove for 5-6 hours, and it becomes tender, all right? And it has a rich, very fatty sauce, so it feeds everyone. These days, of course, these working class dishes from the 19th century have become national classics, traditional food, regional classics, and so on and so on. Almost all of these regional classics are or have their origins in working class meals from that period. And also have their origins in an industrial environment. Think about the horse meat. Horses were industrial equipment, basically, okay, not meat. As a consequence, very cheap and available to the working classes. So food becomes one of the elements by means of which we can identify the working class, even now. Another thing was the way they dressed. Okay? They were very recognizable. Usually, people had one pair of shoes, all right? One pair of shoes. Those are people who live in the mountains, and this would be the only pair of shoes they had. Other than that, they would wear wooden shoes, right? Or something similar, like the espadrille in France, which is basically a linen shoe, a light linen shoe, right? Most of these people would walk usually without shoes, right? So they would do a lot of life without shoes. Okay. Would be the same with good, nice dresses. They would have one set. Like men would have one suit. Very often they would acquire that suit. It would be given, for instance, on their wedding day, and it would be the only suit they would have for the remainder of their life. They would be buried in that suit as well. And it was the same with ladies. So the working class also becomes identifiable on the basis of how they dress. So you could immediately see who is whom on the basis of how people look. And again, that's a thing that persists now. It was that difference, so the immediate recognizability of the dress of the working class, that led in very many circumstances to the introduction of the uniform, all right? Like, for instance, if you were a domestic worker, you worked as a maid or a servant in the house of a wealthy person, you were not supposed to walk around like that. No, you would have to dress in a uniform. A uniform basically erases the ugliness or the perceived shabbiness of the way in which the working class looks, while of course it emphasizes their identity as working class, right? handmaid or a valet was instantly recognizable, all right? Because he or she had a uniform to wear, and only non-elite people would wear such uniforms. Now, these uniforms these days look quite fancy. I mean, we've all seen, these series in which you see butlers, for instance, and butlers are also always very nicely, at least, they wear, how should I say, almost ceremonial suits, right? Like a white tie or a black tie, okay? Yet, they are instantly identifiable as the lowest of the low, right? And if you want to compare the working class dressed up in a uniform with the real aristocracy, you simply have to look at Boris Johnson now. So the way Boris Johnson now appears, okay, in a very shabby, in a very, poorly designed suit, his hair is all over the place and so on, that is the aristocracy. Those who have the liberty to dress bad are those who have the freedom to do so. They also have the autonomy to do so. Which is why wearing a suit these days as well is very often a sign of a junior function in the company. We had the economic business days, how notably young men look, women as well, how were they dressed? Blue suit, brown shoes. Why would they do that? And what exactly do they do in the way of activities during the economic business days? Networking, things like speed dating. So here are the guys from ING and KLM, the big industrial powers, the banks, the insurance companies, and so on. And you have a few minutes to speak to these very important individuals to see whether there's a match, whether this is work. And because you're meeting somebody very, very senior and very, very superior to you, and you want a job from that person, that's why you need to wear a suit. And miraculously, they all look alike. So what you need to do during the speed dating is you need to be able to show that you are unique, okay? That you stand out from the crowd. So when you're a CEO and you walk into an office and you look like Boris Johnson, everyone will know that you're the boss. All the others are dressed a lot better than you. So dress code again here becomes a very important indicator of social class. And again, it persists until now. And so this is again a thing that is a very, very lasting in a way. Now when we look at the labor movement, so you have these indexes, these elements of visibility. The working class becomes a visible, recognizable item in society. Politically, it begins to get organized from the middle of the 19th century onwards as the labor movement. And it's an international movement, it happens more or less independently all over Western Europe, as indeed also in the United States and elsewhere. One of the things you need to know is that when we speak about the labor movement, very, very quickly, so historically, there are always two branches to it, a smaller one and then a bigger one. The smaller one is the radical one, usually anarchists or libertarians, in which there is an idea which is absolutely central, and the idea is that the working class has a different culture, okay? And has to have its own identifiable lifestyle. And so the idea that there's nothing wrong with being working class. No, the opposite is true. It is a sign of pride. So when we look working class and we behave working class, it's good. It's good. Now, this has always been a minority movement, if you wish. The second branch, a more moderate one, social democrat, had a completely different vision on that. And here the central idea was the working class needs to be moved up in the direction of the bourgeoisie. Okay, so the ideal of what was called emancipation, so we have to emancipate the working class, And very concretely, it meant that the working class has to become equal, almost identical to the middle class, to the bourgeoisie. So all ideas were basically bourgeois ideas. And it is that last, let's say, second branch that basically shaped our societies, all through the 20th century. I'm going to give a few elements now. A very important element was education. So this labor movement had a number of very clear demands. One of the demands was universal education. The children of the working class basically have to be educated in exactly the same way as the children of the other classes, of the superior classes. And so, universal education. And it had to do, of course, with the creation of an intellectual elite, but at the same time also with giving ordinary people real levers of autonomy. It is good if you can read, right? Like, for instance, read the stuff that others write about you. It's really, really good. It's also good if you can write, like, the creation of a record of injustice or of exploitation. It's really good that you can do that, all right? And so here is one of the features of our societies now, universal education. If we are in this room now, all right, this, so even now, more than a century later, it is an effect of this. In an earlier regime, I would never have gone to university, and I think that counts for a good number of you guys. So this was, let's say, item one. So you have the emergence of the big schools in the notably early 20th century all over Europe. Note also the uniforms. The idea behind uniforms was you have to hide poverty. And so everyone is equal. And so this is the rationale of uniforms, even now in a number of schools, It is by introducing uniforms that all children basically are able to some extent, erase the traces of social class. Make it invisible. At the same time, of course, they become very visible as working class students. It's always a double bind that we already mentioned. Next point, housing. And basically that starts from the 1930s onwards. So the idea that working class people must live in good houses, decent houses, okay? Houses that have all the facilities that were called modern, like, water, electricity, central heating, but also hygienic facilities like a bathroom, a flush toilet, and so on and so on. Now, all of this was also a big priority. So we have to create middle-class housing and also give it to the working class. So working class people need to be able to acquire a home that has all the middle-class facilities. And if you look at the history of architecture through the 20th century, with, for instance, Corbusier, Bauhaus, and so on and so on, all of these guys were ultra creative in exactly that. How do we build large numbers of spaces for working class living that also offer, modern facilities, modern comfort, and so on. So it has been an immense, an immense incentive for architecture in the 20th century. Social housing has always been that. So housing is very, very important. And it led to things like this, Rotes Wien. So there is this neighborhood which even now, is known as Rotes Wien, Red Vienna. Those were social houses built by the labor movement, and they looked like this. They also had a military function. And so when there would be a revolution, those could basically be fortresses from which you could shoot or, let's say, defend yourself to attackers. Another thing was, the labor movement also wanted luxury for the people. Or at least there had to be a number of big facilities for working class people that really looked like the palaces of the aristocracy. And so all over Europe you find magnificent buildings that go back, to the early 20th century. and basically were like the headquarters of the labor movement, but usually also included theater facilities, rooms for meetings, and so on and so on. Here you have one from Ghent, the old building of the Blommaert in Ghent. This is the theater. It's beautiful, absolutely splendid theater. It's very modern as well. And then if you read the inscription above, which is Dutch, it basically says, art makes you noble, noble. So it refers to the aristocracy. And here was the idea. The working class usually is excluded from art and from like lively culture, literature and so on. Okay? And we need to offer that to them in such a way that they are able to be uplifted to a higher level. And again, the ideal here, here was the bourgeoisie. So this also you see. So we need to participate in culture and so on. Health, the body, working class had to be healthy, strong. And in the beginning of the 20th century, you see also the beginning of a sort of iconography of the working class body as a beautiful body. Now remember, it used to be ugly, right? So it used to be readable as ugly. Well, starting in the early 20th century, you begin to see a completely new iconography as the working class having the healthiest bodies. They're lean, they're strong, they are muscled, they're healthy, and so on and so on. All sorts of health campaigns, like don't drink, yet I don't drink. Also look at how he's dressed. So this is working class. Another interesting thing was that the labor leaders always had to look like gentlemen. Right? There was a thing that struck me even when I was young, and I would meet those leaders of trade unions and of socialist parties and so on and so on. They would always be immaculately dressed. And so I would ask members of trade unions, I would say, they look like the bourgeoisie. And the answer would be they have to. They have to look like equal to the others. So they should not be distinguishable from the entrepreneur, from the millionaire, from the political leader of another party. They should look exactly like them. So here again is the idea of a uniform. So we need to be equal, and it needs to be visible. So it needs to be readable from the way in which we look. So here's the first socialist government in consumption. After the Second World War, you get also the production of mass objects for the working class, specifically for the working class. I'm sure you recognize some of the cars here. Volkswagen, of course the word itself means the car of the people, the ordinary people, the German people at some point, but ordinary people in general. The Austin Mini, very small car for working class families. And of course the 2 chevaux, the Citroën 2 chevaux, which was absolutely iconic. Very cheap cars, but good cars, decent cars. And they included the working class in mass consumption at this level. So little by little, and we're going to conclude here for the first part, what you see is that uplifting the working class. So let's go back now to the headline, how to make the working class behave. The answer was we're going to try to make them behave like the bourgeoisie. So little by little, step by step, and in a sort of never-ending sequence through the 20th century, you begin to see that the working class is identified and educated as a middle class, as a bourgeoisie, an extension of the bourgeoisie. So all the things that were seen as normal at the level of the bourgeoisie in terms of the way you dress, the level of education, the things you consume, how you live, like housing, all right? Also the organization of the family, we will return to that later. All of that is on the basis of the norms of the bourgeoisie. So little by little, we begin to see a bourgeois ideal for the working class as behavior. The good working class, all right, A decent working class is one in which all members behave as if they were not working class but middle class. And that's a normativity basically that Foucault describes. He describes it in this particular fragment on page 268 to 69, right? The normalness of the bourgeois norm for almost everything, okay? Including sexuality. And sexuality we will address after the break. Let's take a 10-minute break. Let's proceed towards Foucault's main objective, and ours, which is the body. And what follows, I will try to explain on Foucault. I mean, in my view, there are things that he overlooks in his historical review, basically. There are a number of aspects of the growth of modern society that he overlooks. And when we try to incorporate these overlooked dimensions, it has an effect on how we can see sexuality right now. You know, the handling of the body and on the sexual nature of the body. We have to start from where we started before, of course. So the fear of revolution. But now we're going to try to reformulate it in Foucault's own terms. So it has to do with the control over sexuality, getting children. One of the things, of course, why was there a fear of revolution? Well, it had to do with the figures. Okay, so the working class was a lot larger in terms of numbers than the middle class, notably in cities. So we had huge, what we would now call slums, very, very big slums, all right, that were vastly more populated than middle class areas. So it was a problem, and it was aggravated by another thing, and that was the perception of uncontrolled sexuality within the working class. Foucault has already mentioned that on a number of occasions in the book. So the working class, at least in the eyes of the middle class, had a problem, and the problem was uncontrolled sexuality, okay? And as a consequence, very big families, lots of children, would be blamed, of course, on moral dimensions, like, you know, they are degenerated. Their sexuality was called fornication, so they don't make love, they fornicate. It was associated with being drunk, being violent, being you know, very loose morals, and so on and so on. While, of course, in reality, a lot of what was basically seen as uncontrolled sexuality out of control, was an effect of marginalization, poverty. Notably, when we address 19th century prostitution. You guys know Jack the Ripper? He murdered brutally and horribly a number of women who at the time were identified as prostitutes, okay? They were identified as prostitutes. Those were women he addressed in the streets and from whom he solicited sexual services in return for money. Now, of course, more than a century after these murders, and a lot of investigation, a lot of writings about what happened and also the individuals involved and so on, we now know that, yes, these women, they traded sexual favors for money, and in that sense, yes, we could call them prostitutes, but most of them had to do it because it was the only thing they had economically. So in other words, it was not professional prostitution, but in a way necessitated prostitution. So you needed money urgently. You had nothing else. The only thing you have to trade is your body. That's when you go out and you sell it for a day or for an hour or for a night or for a few minutes in order to have that money. You still have that in very poor areas of the world, and I've worked in such areas. It's dramatic. Mothers who lack the equivalent of €1 in order to buy a bag of maize for their family, and they have to offer, let's say, sexual favors in return for the food. It's heartbreaking if you see it. So this was the case. Loose morals, yes, if you wish, but at the same time, a lot of what was called uncontrolled sexuality was also socially and economically motivated. So there were deeper reasons behind it. But of course there was, again, the political risk involved. So imagine these huge urban working classes getting more and more and more children, a lot more than middle class, right? More and more children. And in the end, of course, we will be outvoted. For the moment we have voting rights, we will be ruled by socialists, by the working class. So this was not really, really good. And we already know that the working class were indeed a rebellious, revolutionary social formation. And then here's the bourgeois norm, as we see it emerging in this period, the bourgeois norm for sexuality. And it emerges, let's say, basically starting in the middle of the 19th century. And here is what Foucault overlooks. So he zooms into the connection between this new view of sexuality, the controlled notion of sexuality on the one hand, and the control over the working class, but he overlooks a very important other dimension of the formation of modern societies, and that's colonialism. So in the second half of the 19th century, we also get imperial expansion. This is when most of the world becomes, in a way, ruled by a handful of European nation states. And so colonialism is a very important factor. Notably, when we see the effect it has on sexuality, and there's a relatively good literature on this. What we see in the second half of the 19th century is basically two zones, if you wish, of sexuality, two worlds of sexuality that emerge. And they continue to live right next to each other in a sort of weird relationship with each other, a sort of opposition, if you want. The first world of sexuality is sexuality here, in our own bourgeois society. Okay? And here's a sexuality that Foucault describes. It's controlled, it's a serious business. Right? It's nothing to do with pleasure. It has to do with procreation in view of the construction of the normal family, the bourgeois family. Okay? And it is a duty. It is a duty. And so whenever you have sex, it is your duty to try to make a child. Okay? And there are religious dimensions behind it, but we've already seen also political ones. Large campaigns were organized around that. So this is one world of sexuality. But another one exists and emerges and also goes on. So it lingers on, it has never disappeared. These two worlds have never disappeared, but the second one emerges, notably in the context of expansion, colonial expansion. And let's call it sexuality over there. And so you have our sexuality and you have their sexuality, the sexuality of the other. Okay? And who is the other? The other is working class, okay, or exotic, The other sexuality is the exact opposition of the first one. So the first one was controlled, and the second one is free. No strings attached. The first one was a matter of duty, a very serious business. Here it is about pleasure, about lust. Okay? The first one had to be performed within the confines of the modern family and, of course, marriage. You had to be married before you could have sex. Well, here, of course, that had no effect at all. And so this was entirely, detached from marriage. So what you see is the emergence of a zone of what we could call free sexuality. And Foucault overlooks it. Free sexuality that is basically attached to three things, or at least we see three elements emerge in the second half of the 19th century. The first one is, of course, the job of being a prostitute, the professionalization of prostitution. as a working class profession. So the default prostitute in the second half of the 19th century and all through the 20th century would always be a working class girl. And that would be one. It would be okay to have a particular type of sexuality with working class prostitutes. No problem at all. So if you wanted, free sexuality, they would provide it for you, the working class, the others. Another domain, and I will also go into more detail there, is the exotic world overseas, in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, okay? Where it was absolutely okay to show women naked or half naked. And the argument was, that's how they are. They walk around naked, and in that sense, it's not really sexual if we show it like that. Now, of course, it was a completely different standard from showing the body than the one that applied here in our own sexuality. So within our sexuality here, in the terminology that we use there. Eh? So when sexuality here, within our own world of sexuality, bodies had to be hidden, all right? But when you move to these others, the working class, as well as the colonial subjects, it was absolutely okay to show them naked or in sexual, let's say, positions, right? It was absolutely okay. And a third one, of course, is the emergence of a new genre of writing, a new genre of let's say, art consumption as well, which is pornography. And it becomes, notably in Victorian England, you can still Google a lot of that stuff, a very, very, very lively genre, of course, consumed by the bourgeoisie. And so all of that pornography was written for the bourgeoisie, not for the working class. It was about the working class and about the exotic subject, but it was written for and also by the bourgeoisie. So, little by little, the emerging of two different worlds of sexuality that in a way coexists and weirdly relate to each other. One world of sexuality which is heavily controlled, okay, and has to do, with health and heavily moralized as well, has to do with family and a wife and so on, and children. But another domain or zone of sexuality which is radically different, has everything to do with lust, pleasure, okay, but is, in a way, a separate world, an enclosed world. And it's okay as long as you stay within that zone, within that world. So what we now see here is the othering of bodies. So basically, the erotic body is always the body of another, not our bodies, but their bodies. Okay, so sexually provocative bodies are always the bodies of the other. And it's okay as long as they are the bodies of the other, not our own. Our own are strictly controlled, heavily regulated, and so on. So what we get here, I think, is the existence or the emerging of a domain of overt and exuberant sexualization. So there's a lot of sexuality being shown in the second half of the 19th century and also the first half of the 20th century. Okay, but in the margin, sexualization is marginalization. You need to go to the margins of society to those very specific environments, or even, the margins of the world, very specific environments, and there you will find the erotic bodies of the other. So these two ideals of the body, or normal bodies, emerge. A closed body, a hidden body, an invisible body of the bourgeois norm. So don't even show your ankles, ladies. It might make men wild. Don't do that. Be very, very least. You have to hide everything. On the one hand, and then another body, the body of the other in the margins, which is absolutely open, naked, available, and of course, a big source of lust, pleasure, and excitement, and so on. So you see what happens here. None of this, of course, is economically neutral, or let's say neutral in the sense of the power structures of society. What we see is that free sexuality, of course, becomes a luxury good. All right? So you have to travel, for instance, to the Middle East in order to find these mysterious and extremely sexualized women, or you have to go to Africa, or you have to spend money in a strip club, or in a bar, or with prostitutes, and so on and so on. So it becomes a luxury commodity. You need to spend money, and in that sense, of course, it also becomes an item of inequality. So those who are able to spend money will get free sexuality. Those who are not will basically transgress the rules of our society, all right? And let's say get into trouble here. So two worlds that emerge, all right, with completely different rules and with a very clear structure of organization internally as well as in relation. These I'm sure you've seen, they still sell them, you know, in flea markets and so on. So not much of it is good. And half a century later, you have what is called sexual liberation. And so this basically happens late 1950s, early 1960s. So I'm making a jump now. So as long as you had a colonial system, you had this very, very strong sexualization of the colonial other, as well as of the working class. And then something happens after the Second World War. We call it the sexual revolution, sexual liberation. We've already seen that free sexuality was only available in highly specific zones of inequality. And so it was a relationship between the wealthy and the strong with the weak and the available. Now that changes after the Second World War. That changes in the context of what we call liberation, sexual liberation. Liberation in the sense of it is made free. In many ways, so when I say that before that free sexuality was only available in the margins, the big feature of the sexual revolution was the breaking out of the margins of, free sexuality. It's in the context of the sexual revolution that it is okay, for instance, to have sex before, say, marriage, to have sex with multiple partners. Little by little, also, it was okay to be gay, all right? It was also okay to show your body. It was okay to look sexy. It was important even, to look sexy and attractive and sexually available and so on. So it was okay to be single. Okay? So all these marginal forms of sexuality now, little by little, become mainstream. They're breaking out of the margins. And in very many ways, that also means a big power shift. Those women, all right, who used to be the objects of that free sexuality, those who had to supply it, so to speak, to people who had, the resources to afford it. But those women now basically become autonomous. They make decisions themselves. They are no longer simply subject and dependent on men. So you have a very, very big shift in control. Okay? And in many ways, these two worlds, here and there, so sexuality here, sexuality there, merge. You begin to see that these very big, strong, and also heavily moralized distinctions between the two gradually merge. In very many ways, sexuality remains controversial and also morally rejected by large, let's say, segments of the population. But at least it's no longer an absolutely marginal thing. It's okay. It's okay to do it. It's okay to, for instance, also enjoy sex, have it for pleasure, not for children. It's okay. However, so yes, it is liberation, it is empowering, but here's Foucault again. No freedom without conditions. There's no unconditional freedom. You can have that freedom only if you exert more control over sexuality. Like, for instance, birth control. There's a literature, of course, that argues that the introduction of the fertility pill, so the anti-conception pill, is one of the most important feminist moments in history, in the sense that indeed it gave women control over their own sexuality, and in that sense also their own life as a subject, right? It gave them real autonomy. It gave them the power to decide whether or not they would have children. Okay? However, you have to take that pill. So you have to regulate your sexuality. You can have an entirely different new form of free sexuality, no longer the constrained and highly moralized one, in many ways, defined the sexual lives of the generations before us. No, you can have it. However, you have to be in control, right? You have to follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, then of course, so you see the birth control review, you have the burden of unwanted babies. And here, of course, the image draws it as the absence of freedom. You're in a jail with a very big ball and chain around your ankles because an unwanted baby takes away your freedom. So if you want your freedom, you have to practice birth control, right? So in other words, you have to start implementing all these recipes that Foucault describes in his book if you want to be free, if you want to have a liberated sexuality. Okay? And if not, then you will, you become a teen mom. And we all know, the heavy moralization that we have in reality TV shows about these individuals. Very often there is the suggestion, that they were out of control, that they got a child way too early, they didn't use their mind, they made a mistake, they didn't think about what they were doing, and so they made the wrong decision. So all these old moralizations, of course, come down on those who practice free sexuality without control. So here again, the essence of the work of Foucault, no freedom without control. So there are rules for being free, lots and lots of rules, and you can only be free when you implement all those rules, when you follow them meticulously, when you organize yourself meticulously. Rules for being free, rules for displaying a sexualized body, rules for organizing yourself as a sexual subject. This is what he discusses, what is absolutely central and has a genesis all through the 19th and the 20th century, and it brings us right here. What we now get is in reality an extremely controlled free sexuality, a performance of sexual freedom, all right, that looks like freedom but is in effect very heavily organized and subject to numerous norms, both very big norms and very small norms. And in many ways, it is organized on the basis of frames and forms. So it's okay to have a free sexuality and express it, and also to sexualize yourself, but it has to be done very, very, very carefully. So it has to be done according to enormous numbers of rules. The examples that I give here, for instance, Temptation Island, an explicitly sexualized reality show, okay? And they can have indeed sexual relationships with each other on that island, but they have to do a lot of work in order to get it. And it's heavily controlled, right? It's full of rules. And if you break the rules, you're out. It's okay now, when you're a woman, to show yourself in underwear, even when it's not in a commercial for underwear. It's okay to do it, but don't overdo it. Not everyone should do it, and if you do it, it needs to be done in a particular way. It needs to be done, for instance, artistically. So again, here we see, it's okay to be free. It's okay to be overtly sexualized, right? And also do even more than a suggestion. Show a lot of yourself as a sexual subject. However, it is heavily controlled, and you have to follow the rules. When we look at morphing bodies, so a body that moves from one visualization to another, it also means that it moves from one set of norms to another. What are these norms? So this is the question. And now we know that there is a history to it, and that a lot of what we see here has meaning that, that has historical meanings. So it's not just produced here and now, and in the context of what we now see on Instagram. No. It is in many ways the reproduction of a very, very old sort of system of dual sexuality gradually merging, but at the same time also increasingly